Expedition 44. Here today, I'm solo hosting the show with two super fun people. I'm very excited about today's show. Matt was not able to join us for this morning, but we have a full show planned. I'm excited to have both Aubrey E. Buster and John H. Walton on the show. Recently, they have written the Book of Daniel, chapter 1 through 6 commentary. This is part of the New International Commentary on the Old Testament by Eerdmans. We've had John on the show for many times. He is my all-time favorite go-to guy, especially being an Old Testament person. It doesn't get any better than John Walton. John, thank you so much for joining us again. I feel like you're one of the boys on the Expedition 44 team here, but it is always just such a delight to have you on the show. And we have some pretty incredible scholars, theologians on here, so I hold that very strongly when I say you're the Expedition 44 favorite person. So always a delight to have you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Very kind, Ryan. Always good to be part of the conversation.
Thank you. Um, Most of you know quite a bit about John Walton. I don't know that I really need to say anything about him, but like I said, in my mind, he is the number one Old Testament scholar in the country. He's a guy that we're going to look back kind of like a C.S. Lewis in 100 years, and I think there's only a few of those I can think of on my hands. So, John, excellent. Always looking forward to ancient Near East conversations with us. I could get into your bio, but it would take me about the hour that we have slated for this show to get through the whole thing. So, anything new with you? Anything you want to mention to catch us up?
I just want to say that it's a good thing you got that description from my mother. It's the Daniel Project, of course, as we've been working on it for 7 or 8 years, and it's great to see it coming out. I'm currently working on a book called The Crisis of Biblical Authority, and that'll be coming out next year. It's in editorial now, so that's been a fun project I've been doing too. Different sorts of things.
Yeah, really good. And you're supposed to be in retirement, but I've never known you to stop working, and it doesn't look like you're there. I was joking earlier that back bookshelf is about the cleanest I've ever seen it in my many years of knowing you, and I'll take that as a compliment. It looks good.
Yep, yep. Just added new books that I got at SBL, so yep.
Yeah. And we also have Dr. Aubrey E. Buster. I'm super excited for Dr. Buster. She is an incredible scholar. I've been wanting to get on our show for quite some time. She joined Wheaton faculty in 2018. She comes from Emory University, recipient of the George W. Woodruff Fellowship. Um, Tons of great research here, Dr. Aubrey. Psalms, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, Dead Sea Scrolls, remembering the story of Israel, historical summaries and memory formation in Second Temple Judaism, and now co-author with Dr. Walton in Daniel. And I can't wait. I'm not even quite all the way through the first one, but I can't wait for Daniel 7 through 12 and then NICOT series to come out too. But Aubrey, just take a few minutes and tell us a little bit about your life, your scholarship, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like John, I've been working mostly in the Book of Daniel for the past 7 years, which is a little bit of a pessimistic number, actually. I'm like, that's a time, and half a time times two, which is just about, so that's been my focus. Before that, I have worked a lot in memory and in Second Temple Judaism. And I think that was what was one of the fun things about working on this project. Is Daniel is a book that crosses cultures. And so John's extensive work in the ancient Near East, and I was one of John's students. And so he also made us do extensive work in the ancient Near East. But then also my work before this has focused more on the Persian and Hellenistic periods and how texts developed under empire as Israel returned to the land. So that's really my focus. And Daniel was just a thrilling area of research for that.
I would love to have you back on again to just talk about that. that's quite a sentence full in terms of its own. But
Yeah.
let's jump into today's project. This is a book I am super super excited about. So far, I have to say, we were discussing this a little bit, but most of our Expedition 44 listeners know that I read a lot. I mean, this is just my favorite thing in life. I'm passionate about reading great theological material, and I usually read 3 or 4 works. I'm connected with Eerdmans and IVP and do a lot of things with them. And so I have the I have the opportunity to read what I would say are the best works of our generation. I mean, if it's out there, I'm reading it. We're interviewing those people. Where Matt and I are also then teaching on the same subjects and things like that. I'm connected with the King's Commission School of Divinities, so we have lots of students that we're teaching this kind of stuff. And I'm always looking for what are we going to put into our curriculum, because I say I want the very best. I want our students to be gleaning from the best that our current world has to offer, whether it was written last month, as in the case of this one, or whether it was written 100 years ago. That's what we want to be looking at. And so before we get started, I just want to say that I am not done reading this book. I have not experienced a book. I can't remember. I mean, it's been 10, 15 years since I've read a book in the way that I am reading this one right now. And that really is the greatest compliment that I can give you guys. I mean, I've read some really good books this year, and I haven't spent more than maybe 2 days on any of them. I mean, I usually just sit down and read the whole thing and I'm done with it, and I'll write a review on it and move on. And the day I received this, I didn't get past the bibliography. I mean, I love bibliographies, and I love to know what smart people read. And I mean, I was 3 hours in and was only halfway through the bibliography probably. And so it was phenomenal. And now I hate to say this, that we scheduled this a month ago and I'm not done with this book yet. I mean, I've been slowly reading 40, 50 pages a day, and like I can't read it any quicker than that. Like I just want to savor it. It's such an amazing work. And I've read an awful lot of commentaries. My personal favorite probably goes back to Robert Alter's, just trying to translate some of the Old Testament stuff better. I of course don't always agree with everything, but it's fascinating to read through it. And I would have to say that this is all of that and a whole lot more. Sometimes when I read Alter, he has a verse and he'll give a paragraph for it. And I'm like, oh, this verse needs so much more than a paragraph. And now we've got it right here. I mean, pages and pages and pages. And it's Daniel, which is probably my favorite thing. If I had to ask you guys to do one work in the whole Old Testament where I would have wanted to read, it would have been Daniel. I mean, just such a incredible, fascinating book, just because of the multifacetedness of it, like, I mean, I love a lot of stuff. I love Genesis. I could spend my whole life in Genesis, as I'm sure both of you guys could too, but I mean, Daniel is just amazing. So anyway, I need to stop talking because I want to hear from you guys. So first of all, tell me a little more about NICOT. I know there's a handful of these books out there, but give us a little bit of backgrounds with Eerdman's, how you guys came to work with this project, and what is involved with the rest of the NICOT books. I can't imagine, I haven't read any of the other ones. I'm going to after this, but I can't imagine they're all as thick as this, or cover things with I don't even know how to describe it, the depth that you guys get into this. So just tell me a little bit about some of the other ones and what that is.
Well, NICOT series began in the 1960s. And the first editor was E.J. Young. That was even in the 50s, and quickly transitioned to R.K. Harrison, who then guided that series for some time. The volumes have been coming out very gradually over the decades, and some volumes still are not out. Again, Daniel was not out before. Other volumes are being replaced, but it has taken its place as the premier evangelical commentary series. And I use evangelical very broadly there because it does seek to encompass all of scholarship, not just an evangelical viewpoint.
Yeah.
Um,
I love that
there,
about it. I think that's great.
yeah, there are numerous 2-volume ones out there. Ezekiel was 2 volumes, Isaiah was 2 volumes, but of course there are many, many chapters. Samuel, of course, 1st and 2nd Samuel, but there are still some volumes that aren't out yet. So it's still being worked on. Deuteronomy is coming out in replacement. That's going to be 2 volumes. 1 volume's out already.
And
So
you guys just had to go for the record because I think you're on mark to be about 15 volumes on this one right about now.
And I have to say that's a real gift from the publisher, because that's
Yeah.
something that we asked of Eerdman's when we were
Okay.
about halfway through, and just said, because it was far longer than the original word length that we were allotted, and that they allowed us to publish at this length is a gift. Because I think while not everyone wants to read 2,000 pages on the Book of Daniel, some people do.
Yeah.
And so I hope that this provides that commentary for those people.
And Dr. Aubrey, you probably don't know this, but Expedition 44 started about 6 years ago, and John was one of the first people that we wanted to get on the show. And so this has sort of been a tongue-in-cheek joke that we've had interviewing John with other projects, because I would start out saying the same thing I did today is, what are you working on? And for 6 years, it's been Daniel now. So
it called for that kind of attention. And we were really glad that the publisher and the general editor, Bill Arnold, were willing to give us that leeway to do it.
Yeah.
So I've spoken a little bit about this already, but I guess I want to just take another second and say this is a hermeneutical masterpiece. I mean, the lens that it identifies, it illuminates the cultural textures of Daniel's. It's remarkable. One of your reviewers, I think, called it a treasure trove of literary, historical, and theological thought. And I would absolutely agree. I feel like I'm stepping into a time capsule into the ancient world. I mean, so often when you read something in your Bible, you just don't really know the context. And a lot of times you can have a small commentary and get a paragraph, but I'm one of those that just said that's not nearly enough. I want to dive into the whole multifaceted layers of all of this. And I don't know that you guys could have done any better of a job on this one in Daniel. I mean, I still go back and reread a lot of this just for fun. It really, I can't say better words about it. It's magnificent. It's extraordinary. Um, how do you approach something of this kind of magnitude? I mean, we've already joked around about 7, 8 years of this, but I mean, you stayed so concise and consistent throughout this project. How do you I mean, somebody said, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time, but I mean, how do you approach a work like this?
Very few people would consider a 1,000-page book as concise.
That's right.
Um,
So thank you for that.
but, yeah.
So you're hearing my verbiage there. I'm glad you picked up on that. Yeah.
And though we're very grateful that you can't think of any way that could be better, we're sure that our reviewers will be able to discover some of those.
Yeah.
I know the book is new, but I haven't found one bad word on it, and I'm usually pretty good at digging up that stuff.
Yeah.
So
We could probably come up with a list, right? Like you're always, I feel always aware. We're very proud of it, but always,
Yeah.
you're always learning. We're not done learning about Daniel.
yeah.
So it's, how do we go about it? Well, just one topic at a time, one verse at a time, one passage at a time. That's all you can do, to take it one at a time and then step back and look at it and say, did we do everything that we needed to do? And of course, you probably have noticed we have many long excurses where we said, we have to go beyond verse by verse here. There's a lot here to cover, whether it's Son of Man or whether it's the 70 weeks or whatever it might be. Darius the Mede. So those are all things that need careful attention.
Yeah. John, you're famous for doing things like writing a book, and then you often write like a little pre-book within the book on interpretation. And so you're very faithful about wanting people to understand what's going on in your head in proper interpretation before you actually get into it. And some of this book is sort of like that, but it's a little bit different than your other works. I've joked around that the first time I got this, I normally read a book in, 2-3 hours, sort of, just bombing through it. This one, I put my normal, as soon as it came in the mail from Eerdman's early release, I sat down with it in my favorite chair, cup of coffee, and 3 hours in, I was only halfway through the bibliography, which you sort of start out with all these abbreviations, everything else. I love that kind of. I always joke about kind of a first shall be last, backwards kingdom, Jesus kind of thinking. And so right away I'm thinking, oh, that's interesting, this backward methodology kind of thing. But why start out with so much of all of that? I mean, it's 100 pages before you even get into the book here.
Yeah. Well, putting the bibliography in the front is actually a characteristic of the NICOT series. They all do it that way. So that wasn't our choice. That wasn't our call.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have let us do it any differently. It was just how they do it. With regard to the hermeneutics part, I always say that every book I write is a hermeneutics book, no matter what it really is, whether it's a backgrounds book or a lost world book or a theology book or a commentary. It's all got to start with hermeneutics. And so I used to tell my students that too. Every course I teach is a hermeneutics course because no matter what we're doing in the course, we have to lay that out. So I think that's really important for bringing the readers along with me so they know what lens we're looking through and what our objectives are.
Yeah. Just a couple things about that. Like it is helpful when you're reading a commentary to know that a lot of the structure of it is given to the authors. And this determines a lot of what we can do. It was one of the reasons that we loved the NICOT series, is that it allows us to do the kind of technical work while still maintaining a high view of scripture and giving us the space to do a really detailed verse by verse commentary. The other thing I'll say about the hermeneutic focus is that I think we felt a real responsibility to our audience to take even more time. I think our introduction is about 200 pages. And we really felt a responsibility to give that to our audience because Daniel has been a site of remarkable controversy. Probably Daniel and creation. Could we put those two together as the areas of the Bible that have divided the church and divided scholarship? And we wanted to give the space to honor both of those parties, to not dismiss one. I don't know if we'll get into this, but a lot of the controversy has to do with dating and whether Daniel, the actual historical figure, said or wrote each word. And we didn't want to, in this particular series, just address those issues summarily. We felt like we wanted to take our audience through our thought process so that even if they come to a place where they didn't agree, they could at least understand how we were making those decisions and that we weren't making any of those decisions in a desire to dismiss either of these two parties or not taking these issues in scripture seriously. So part of that length came through a real responsibility for our audience in treating this book.
Of course, we never expect everybody to agree with us.
We do not.
There's going to be lots of people who disagree, but we want them to see how we arrived at our conclusions. I really dislike it when books give us their conclusions without showing us how they got there. And it's like your old grade school math teacher who said you got to show the work, not just the answer. And so the hermeneutics is part of that. So that's part of full disclosure, and it's part of courtesy to the reader.
It's really well done. And Aubrey, to your point, like I think this interview could go 8 hours today, and we would still feel like we're just getting the tip of the iceberg. So this is, out of all the interviews I've done, and that's been hundreds so far, this is probably the one that I'm thinking, I don't know how we justify this in an hour today. I mean, there's so much. And so what we're going to do is, this is going to be part one, and we're going to kind of talk about the context, the background, the forework to the book. And then part two, we'll get to in about a month or so from now. And we'll kind of jump into that part of really the content of Daniel itself. So that's the framework for today's interview, is really more of the behind the scenes, more of what went into it. The preface of Daniel, we'll say the John Walton, hermeneutic before you actually start the book. That's today's plan. And so the table's set really well. I love talking about the background stuff as much, if not more, than anything else. The layers, the context, all that kind of stuff. So, anyway, let's move on with some diving in questions. Aubrey, I hope we get to everything you just insinuated today, but I'll take whatever you guys want to jump in there and steer it. Daniel might be the most interesting linguistic book in the Bible. And you cover this so well. There's Qumran conversation, Old Greek, Masoretic text, the Theodotian, Hebrew, Aramaic, loan words, Akkadian, Persian. I mean, every one of those things I just said, we could have an hour, if not longer, conversation on. So,
Why don't you go to sleep?
yeah, I mean, just why is this linguistically such a complex book? Just in most of our, I'd say you can dive in a little bit here. I mean, nobody that listens to this stuff is your normal churchgoer. I mean, they're all knee deep into this stuff. So go ahead and speak on a little bit deeper level on all of the linguistic problems, issues, everything going on.
Yeah. And we're not the normal churchgoers either. So these are our people, right? So we clearly speak that nerd language. So Daniel it's one of the only books in the Old Testament that's written in two languages. So part of it is in Hebrew and part of it is in Aramaic. And the Aramaic starts in the middle of a verse, which I think is maybe one of the clues to
so bizarre. Yeah, it's so bizarre.
It's so bizarre. And then, of course, outside of the Hebrew Aramaic shift, there are more Akkadian loanwords, Persian loanwords, Greek loanwords that we have in other texts. And I think that those linguistics themselves convey a message about what the book is doing and how it's interacting with its context. Daniel is a book about Israel, about the Jews living under various foreign empires and needing to speak those languages. Aramaic was the lingua franca of both the Babylonian and then, of course, the Persian Empire. And so you can see the book of Daniel moving in and out of this kind of native Judean language and the language of empire. And I think that's part of the shtick. For it's almost, I almost wish we didn't have to translate it just into English. It would be so fun if you could translate the book of Daniel into like various imperial languages over time.
Yes.
A mix of, Spanglish, and then you get like a German loanword, because it's tracking the history of empire. Yiddish.
There you go. There's your next book. I would love that.
Right. That would get the feel of this book across even more accurately, because that's what it's doing. It's tracking the traces of empire and the way that it speaks, but then of course coming back to Hebrew. So the linguistic texture of the book is a signal of the way that this text is interacting with culture and commenting on it. So even though we did end up just translating it into English, I think those various notes that we give on the loanwords are important, not just for kind of nerdy, scholarly, linguistic conversations, but for how anybody should read and understand this book and how it's working.
One of the examples of that is the musical instruments in chapter 3, which Aubrey made some wonderful. Maybe you can just summarize briefly what you.
So one of the funny quirks about Daniel 3 is that there are both Akkadian, there's a series of Akkadian loanwords, there's Persian loanwords, there's Greek loanwords, and then at the end they're dressed like Scythians, which is a group that we would associate most with maybe the kind of eastern stretches of the Persian Empire in the 2nd century. And that's been treated a lot of ways. It's been part of the dating conversation. But when I looked at that chapter, I really considered it rhetorically, because one of the things is these loanwords are not spread equally amongst these lists. One list tends to focus on loanwords from the Persian government. The musical instrument list is almost entirely Greek loanwords, and then they're dressed in these kind of Scythian clothes. And if you were able to pick up those linguistic hints, this would have done something for the audience. And what we ended up arguing was that this is kind of the story form of the statue that we see in Daniel 2, tracing this movement through empires. And the way that a Judean person listening to this story might have gotten the joke is that Nebuchadnezzar is literally setting up this statue while Persian government officials, and of course the Persians are the empire that are going to defeat the Babylonians, are standing around him. He's setting it up to the tune of Greek instruments, and the Greeks are the empire that's going to defeat the Persians. And he throws a bunch of people into the fire who are wearing Scythian clothes, who's a group of people who's going to challenge the eastern edge of the Persian Empire, in the Greek Empire in the 2nd century. And so literally this scene is set where Nebuchadnezzar is trying to celebrate his singular status as the ultimate king, while these reminders of his imminent downfall surround him. So this is kind of humorous, right? This is something
my kids always ask me what I'm reading right now, and they've noticed that I've had this book in my hand for a while. And so they asked me, Dad, what are you reading right now? This was like around the breakfast table. And I started describing like the instruments and the setting, and they're all looking at me, and our house is a Star Wars house, and they go, "Oh, it kind of sounds like Han Solo in Mos Eisley Cantina when he shoots Greedo." And so,
I thought of the same thing. Oh no.
and I just thought that was great. I'm like, oh my goodness, like that is just perfect, And so, yeah, what a beautiful ancient world kind of picture mosaic to be thinking about when you're reading it. And again, like, how many people never figure this out? They just get through Daniel and they just pass over that like it's nothing, and I could spend days just savoring something like that.
But it gives you a sense for the character of who's like, there's a kind of tongue-in-cheek vibe to this book.
Yeah.
In terms of the way that it talks about empire. On the surface, Daniel and his 3 friends are mostly, with a couple of exceptions, relatively faithful servants of empire, but they're laying out these Easter eggs for their audience, for those who have ears to hear, that empire is always in the process of imminent downfall, and it's not going to be
Huh. So good. So give us one of your favorites out of all of these discussions: Qumran, Masoretic text, loan words, things like that. Give us an Easter egg or two of what we can look forward to read in this.
You have any ideas?
Yeah, in terms of the linguistic flavor, I do think understanding this as rhetorical is key, though it also, so I like to think of my scholarship as my goal is to, as best as is possible, and it's never fully possible, but to as best as possible, get a sense of how this text is interacting with the context. Like if I could construct a time machine and go and meet, an early Jewish person reading and writing some document, that is my goal. And the language to me felt like a door into that context, right? So where you see a text that has Aramaic, Akkadian, some Persian loanwords, you're getting a sense of the way in which this text is interacting with its context. And so I think as much as possible, if we can communicate in any of these instances to our readers a sense of what this was like, this moment of cultural contact and cultural negotiation between and among cultures, we will have succeeded in any of those moments. So it felt to me like in the book of Daniel, you could feel how this text was moving from context to context and changing in contact with it.
So I'm pretty well read, and I was reading the part on literary genre, and you have it listed as court tale. And I hate to say, I've never heard that before. And so, like, that was one of those things that I just jumped way into. I felt like I was borderline an expert on genres of the Bible. I mentioned earlier when we were talking, I love Robert Alter because he was a literary person, and so, I like listening or hearing or reading about the literary part of it. And so this was just one of those things. I guess if I'm sharing Easter eggs, like, there are so many of these in this text. I mean, I think you guys only gave that one a few pages in there, but it's just I could just get into it forever. I mean, there's just so many of those wonderful, rich things to be found in that. And John, I'm sorry for cutting you off there. What were you going to say?
No, I was just going to say, if I would pick out sort of an Easter egg, very much connected to the language, but also connected to the genre, is the question of rhetoric and how
Yeah.
rhetoric operates
Yep.
within these literatures, within these languages, how the languages feed the rhetoric, how the genres feed the rhetoric. And I think that as readers work through it, that's something that they're going to be surprised about. They're going to see us making certain decisions based on rhetorical conclusions. And it's going to open up some new doorways, some that they won't be very comfortable walking through. Others might say, oh yeah, now that makes perfect sense. So I think that's one of the areas where some Easter eggs will be floating around,
Yeah.
understanding the rhetoric of certain aspects of the book.
So our Expedition 44 group is certainly not bound to the Bible that so many people are only familiar with. I mean, I think most of us are reading all kinds of extra biblical material and things like this, and that's one of the things that I find interesting. One of these, let's say, Easter eggs, like we just used the words, is the Greek version of Daniel includes 3 editions not contained in the Masoretic text, and so I find that fascinating. Like, why are they there? You know, the 2 extended prayers, narratives of Daniel 3, 23, 24, Susanna and the bell and the dragon. I mean, and again, like linguistically, like the Hebrew Aramaic conversation going on there, idle polemics. I mean, there's so much you could just discuss on that. What do we do with that?
So I think this, for a reader I can say one thing for a reader who's reading a Bible that has these editions in it. So these are contained in some translations of the English Bible. And I'll say one thing to a reader who isn't familiar with anything that you just said and is like, what are you talking about? So first, I think that understanding these editions in Greek Daniel, so as you said, there's extra stories, and then there's inserted songs, and then there's a middle section that's entirely different. Or that adjusts the language significantly. And I think this provides to us a window even of how Hebrew and Aramaic Daniel came together. Hebrew and Aramaic Daniel is, especially the first part, is a story collection. And the ways that these seem to come together in the ancient world, someone didn't sit down and start, okay, Daniel 1, the food story, and now we end with Daniel 6, and now they're done and they turn it in and here's the Bible. These were very likely circulating stories, probably very popular. Maybe parents would have told them to their children. Maybe they would have been, recited at dinner parties. These were part of the culture, and then were added and collected together at some point, probably in a smaller sub-collection at first. 4 through 6 might have been the first sub-collection, but there were different versions of these story collections circulating, as often happens with popular tales that people talk about a lot. And so the fact that we have both Hebrew and Aramaic Daniel in the Masoretic text, and then these versions of Daniel that have additional stories, as you might expect with a story collection, that have inserted songs, which is something that might happen if people were trying to figure out how to connect the story to their context. We get a sense even of how Hebrew and Aramaic Daniel might have gotten together. We get a sense of how this text is working in context.
Yeah, so good. When my kids were young, I would read them Bell and the Dragon. I don't know if you're familiar with Isaac Gantwerk Mayer put a cantillated Masoretic text version together, and I used to kind of sing that to my kids for a bedtime story tale, and I think they'll remember that forever and ever and ever. And so they've sought to find out more about that interesting story that Dad used to sing to them as a bedside story since then. My son is sophomore in college, and he was in a literary genre class, and the professor brought that up, and oh my goodness, he just went off for like a half hour, and the professor was like, how do you know so much about this Bell and the Dragon thing? And he goes, my dad used to sing it to me when I was a kid. And so I love this part of the story. It's just one of my favorites.
So we didn't spend a lot of time on those editions. We introduced them and speak a little bit about them. Of course, there are whole commentaries on those works as well, and we were not able to get into that as much. But it also gives an interesting dimension about the nature of the book itself. Why are these Hellenistic aspects, Greek aspects, not included in the canonical work? And I think that when we see how the languages interplay within the book, how that Aramaic reflects the world of the Babylonians and the Persians, but then in the 2nd century Hellenistic period, it became unfashionable to use something other than Hebrew. And so we see it going to the Hebrew sections in chapters 8 through 12. And that maybe gives us a hint of why these Greek Hellenistic aspects were not included, because this Hebrew defensiveness has come into play. And so those are not included. So that even gives some hints about who's putting this final book together, even if it's in the Hellenistic period. How happy are they with the Greek traditions? And so it's a whole interesting topic in itself.
I'll say one more thing. It also gives us, I think, insight into the way that the character Daniel functioned, even much later than any version of a historical Daniel would have lived. There appears to be a great cultural desire to keep imagining kind of what Daniel would have done in different circumstances. So the story of Susanna is a young Daniel story where he, stands up for justice, even over against their Jewish elders in that story. And so we get I could compare it to something like some of the apocryphal legends of Abraham Lincoln or George Washington that we like to use as morality tales for children. You have these figures who function in that way. And clearly people wanted more Daniel stories. And then Cyrus, we don't get a Daniel Cyrus story, and they clearly needed one. And so Bel and the Dragon is an example of this. So they don't say, let's think of a new person and write a story about them. They're like, Daniel is already playing this role. As we think about how we want to function under these empires, let's create more stories that feature him, right? So when you can think of a parent when they're like, tell us another Daniel story, Dad. Well, let me tell you about Bel and the Dragon. So we get a sense of how Daniel really functioned as a key figure in the Jewish imagination for a very long period of time.
And just this might go back to a more basic understanding again, but talk about the anti-idolatry polemic in it a little bit. Is that controversial at all, or does everybody read it that way?
The book itself, in the Aramaic and Hebrew parts, don't really have a strong anti-idolatry theme to them. Clearly, the three friends make their stand. They won't bow down to the image of the king, but they don't really give a rant about idolatry in that process. And it really doesn't come up much in the other sections. Daniel 6 and the lions really has no idolatry involved in it at all. So to some extent, that becomes a message of another era. And that's what we find in the Greek works of the editions.
Yeah, interesting. So we've touched a lot of the complicated part of it, but I'm also interested on inspiration and authority, and I think dating comes into play in that conversation. Some would hold that Daniel was completely written by the end of the 6th century, maybe a more mainstream position, while others would say it's 2nd century. Some would just say it sort of never ended, like it just went on forever and ever and ever. Maccabean crisis, Daniel's death. Give us a highlight of that conversation.
Well, let me start, as every Walton book does, with hermeneutics. Because so this is, for us, at the end of the day, a genre question. Because biblical authority is always going to be tied to what the Bible is trying to do. And this varies by genre. And so a misunderstanding of the genre is going to lead to a misunderstanding of the book. I could put it this way: a misunderstanding of what the book is trying to do is going to be a misunderstanding of what it authoritatively does. The difficulty with Daniel, and here's where I have maybe a lot of respect for the controversy, is that the genres that Daniel represents are generally different than a lot of other stories in the Bible. And this is part of its dating. It's interacting with cultures that other parts of the Bible don't interact with to such an extent. And so the court tale genre, for instance, how much is this a genre that freely uses stories and predictable story patterns to think through the issue of living as a Jewish person under empire? And how much freedom does that genre allow to not be writing history? We would argue by other comparisons because we have biblical court tales. So Esther is a court tale. The Joseph narratives are court tales, but there are many more court tales that are written not only by the Jews, but also by other nations that lived under imperial rule. We have court tales from the Egyptian context. We have court tales from the Greek context. And so we can look at a lot of these other examples to ask, what would someone from the ancient world have thought this genre was doing? Would they have thought this was writing history, or would they have thought of this in a more playful sense? And maybe even, as happened in the Old Greek, write new court tales in order to imagine what Daniel would have done in a situation of idolatry. And then similarly, I'll say just briefly, with the apocalyptic texts of Daniel are an example of a genre that's widespread in Second Temple Judaism, but is rarely represented in our Old Testament. And so we can't really look at other examples in the Old Testament to determine what the genre is doing. We need to look at the other works, the other visionary works, the other apocalypses, the other what are often called pseudepigraphic works. I don't love that title, but the other pseudepigraphic works that appear to be doing the same thing as Daniel does. And that was a challenge for us to say, if we are treating Daniel as the same genre as these other works, we have to take that really seriously and not try to compare Daniel falsely or imperfectly to other genres that we find in the Old Testament when it doesn't really match.
One thing that everybody knows about genres is that genres have associated conventions.
That's right.
They work in certain ways. And if you don't understand how they work, you're not going to be able to understand what they're doing and how they're doing it. And so I think that when people fail to recognize some of the genre conventions, they can't really understand what the Bible's authority is doing. Even with the word that we didn't use hardly ever, the word inerrancy says that the Bible is true in all that it affirms. What it affirms is governed by genre, and therefore you can't determine what it affirms unless you're operating within the conventions of the genre. And of course, that's what we try to do. We found lots of the genres and the conventions that we found in Daniel were those that were more familiar from the later periods, the Persian period, the Hellenistic period.
Let me use a really pointed example. So the Danielic authorship, that Daniel authored the book, is often supported through the phrase repeated in the second half, I, Daniel, saw. And this, seems to close the issue. It says, I, Daniel, saw. It was reading the Aramaic dream visions of the Second Temple period where I said, this is a genre convention, because that's how you determine what genre conventions are. There's never a list. There's no guide to genres. Even in our context, here's how you tell what's a textbook. Here's how you tell what's the Bible. And so reading that and saying, this is a genre convention. And how do we know? It appears repeatedly throughout texts of similar kinds in the ancient world. And so that function, we just need to compare it to different and later texts.
So for those that are looking forward to reading this, some are familiar with like the story of Moses. You kind of might hear like perhaps was a lone story, or from King Sargon of Agade and Tower of Babel. John, I know you've done a lot on this, but I think it was Galilee that said this could have been taken off as a Chaldean story of a tower that was destroyed by angry gods. I mean, are some of these stories that you read in Daniel, are they retold in other places in the ancient world, or would this sort of be the first of them? Do the Dead Sea Scrolls give us any sort of enlightenment into those ideas or stories?
There's a lot about the stories that are unique to Daniel, that it's not like we find the same kind of stories about the same kinds of scenarios. But there are certain tropes and motifs that recur. Certainly the question about The choice of food
Mhm.
is one of those. The idea of four empires is one of those tropes.
Okay.
And so we find these tropes. Certainly, the trope of the courtier who is maligned by his fellow courtiers. We have that in the Achikar
Mhm.
court tales, which
Yeah.
show up in Assyrian literature, show up in the Book of Tobit, in Jewish Hellenistic literature, show up in
Yeah.
the Arabian Nights. I mean,
Yeah.
Achikar tropes. So we find tropes that certainly are familiar, but not narratives that are these narratives. Is that a way to say it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, Ahikar would be a court tale narrative.
Right.
Another trope that I might add is the trope of the scholar priest critiquing the king
Yeah.
is a trope that we see, for example, in later Babylonian literature after they're defeated by the Greeks. This is maybe previewing some of Daniel 4. We view that as doing something very similar to the Akitu festival, which was viewed as a way now that they viewed priests as holding kings to account. So this is a trope that we see frequently in the literature. We also see retellings. You mentioned Qumran. We do see some retellings, both of Daniel's stories and of Daniel-like stories in the Qumran literature. So Pseudo Daniel is a text that's really fragmentary, but it also presents an extended version of Israel's history in a very patterned way. And then in 4Q 242, it's called the Prayer of Nabonidus. It names Nabonidus, who is, well, we can maybe get into that. I'll just leave that as a little teaser trailer. It names Nabonidus. That's
There you
important. Get
go.
excited for why. It doesn't name Daniel, but it describes an exorcist, a Jewish exorcist, as someone who comes and tells the king what to do in order to get rid of this skin disease that he has, in order to get right with God. So we do see traces of these similar stories showing up in other cultures and then reimagined Daniel stories in the Old Greek and in Qumran.
But of course, that doesn't mean that Daniel is somehow borrowing narratives
right.
from the ancient world.
Right. Right.
Rather, he's addressing the narratives that he has in terms of the tropes and patterns that are familiar to his audience. You know, we have to recognize the power of pattern.
Yeah.
Whether it's in narratives, which pattern according to motifs and tropes and expectations. Read Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
these
Right.
tropes are there, whether it's narratives or whether it's history. We all want to pattern history to make it make sense, to fit into boxes. You know, they on the calendar, it didn't suddenly turn over and say, now it's Bronze Age 2B.
Yeah.
You know, these are our patternings. The Egyptian, you know, didn't, oh, now we're in Dynasty 18. You know, those are imposed patterns. But that's part of how we understand history. That's part of how Daniel understands history. So patterns in narratives and in understanding the past, it's really important to understand those connections. Otherwise, you don't get the full thrust of all that the author is doing as he plays with those things. We're in his sandbox.
Good. It's so good. And to me, this is the stuff I get giddy about in Daniel. It's these behind the scenes things of I could just dive into it forever. And again, I'll kind of give you illustration. My kids, you mentioned Lord of the Rings, like, there's such a difference between reading those books and getting into it and just watching the movies. I think my oldest rolls his eyes every time somebody wants to start talking about Lord of the Rings and they've never really read anything, He's like, you just have no idea what's really in here or behind it. And that's really the same way I feel about Daniel. Is there's so many people that, I mean, it surprises me that have never even really read the biblical text before, let alone really dove in. And you get into these absurd, end of the world Revelation Daniel conversations. And, it's people that have never read the text. They have no idea what's really going on. And they're getting into all these crystal ball stuff. So you alluded to that. You alluded to kind of magic, divination, things like that. The wise men. Set us straight on all of this, because this is sort of one of my pet peeves, and I think you guys probably have the best handle on how to approach this of anybody.
What is it you want us to set it straight on? Rephrase that question.
Getting into like the crystal ball thinking, the divination of Daniel. These are what we call wise men in history. How does that play into the story? How should the reader, think about this?
I think one of the things that we observed is that Daniel, of course, from chapter 1, he's trained in Babylonian language and literature, which means he had to master the divination texts. That's the core of their literature. And so he had to become, and he became the head of the diviners. I mean, wow, and yet when we find him touching on all of those things that diviners do, he never does them the way the diviners did them. And so again, there's some tongue-in-cheek here that he's using their methods against them, or not using their methods to carry out their objectives. And so it really gives divination a little bit of a black eye. Even as he's part of that institution, he's also subversive of that institution.
And this is one of the key misconceptions that has to do with our culture, because of course we have to understand our culture too. We have cultural patterns that we replicate when we read the stories, just like they have cultural patterns that they replicate when they're trying to tell their stories. We seem to think that the main question concerning divination, and divination is the ways in which you discerned what the gods were going to do, and the ways in which you discerned the will of the deity. So basically communicating with the gods. We are very obsessed today with the question of whether or not God can predict the future. So when we read Daniel 2, for example, we think that Daniel's coming along and he's pulling the mask off of divination, being like, my God can predict the future and your God can't, ha ha ha. Because we're very obsessed with this conversation. This is also how we treat prophecy. Like, oh my goodness, that's amazing that God predicted the future. We're so impressed. Now we're going to worship God. In the ancient world, nobody was wondering whether gods predicted the future. They believed that gods crafted the future. They decreed the future. And so this question of which god can tell you what's going to happen tomorrow, like some kind of magic trick, just was not a question. It wouldn't have been impressive in the ancient world. The question was, which god will communicate to you the plans that they're decreeing, and which god is setting the plans. So I think this helps us to reinterpret, for example, Daniel 2. This isn't, oh, look, Babylonian diviners are fake and future prediction isn't real and only God can predict the future. The real issue is that no gods are telling the Babylonian diviners what they're about to do. This is a statement of relationship and honor and value, because when gods decided to communicate to you as the king, as a diviner, what they were about to do, this was a sign of significant value. So when Nebuchadnezzar in that story responds to Daniel's interpretation of the dream, Nebuchadnezzar recognizes not, wow, you're good at predicting the future, but this is a person who's in very close relationship with a clearly powerful God. I need to take them very seriously. And so he gives him these gifts at the end. And so I think we read Daniel obsessed with this question of whether or not God can predict the future, without this sense of, no, the point of Daniel is that God is decreeing the future, and then even in Babylon, and is then continuing to present God's people as those who have a privileged relationship with this deity who is also in charge.
And this gets us back to one of the questions, or one of the issues that I raise all the time, is that as Bible readers, as interpreters, we are too often so focused on asking our questions that come out of our culture, and they're trying to answer the questions we have, instead of letting the Bible do its own thing in its own terms. So we always want to push ourselves into the Bible instead of letting the Bible push itself into us. And that just shows up in all kinds of ways that we tend to read the Bible.
Yeah. Well, we're about an hour into this interview, and we've hardly even dove into the pages of this amazing book that you guys produced. It's an incredible contribution. I just want to, kind of on the part of the academic world, say thank you for this incredible gift. I mean, it's just so well done, and I get giddy every time I pick it up. This is my happy place in life right now. I think it's just a wonderful thing to be. I've already now had 2 days where I'm sure I'm supposed to be off doing something else, and I've just got trapped in my little chair, in my own little ancient world portal to Daniel. So what a beautiful thing. As we wrap up kind of the introduction, what you need to know before we really dive into this, I'm sure I've forgotten a lot of questions to ask you. There's so much important, and I mean, readers are just going to have to read it. They're just going to have to dive in. But is there anything major that you want to kind of comment on before we kind of bring part one of the introduction to a close?
I think one of the things that we really wanted to do was to help readers to navigate the path with us.
Mm-hmm.
We've obviously, it doesn't take much reading in the volume. We've obviously adopted one of the conclusions that is not a traditional conclusion. That is, that the book is the product of the second century,
Yeah.
where it was finally put together. And we know that some traditional readers will have trouble swallowing that. So we really wanted to show how we got there, even as people who really firmly embrace biblical authority, and how we
Yeah.
got there based on sound hermeneutical principles. And so that idea of helping readers to come along with us to say, here's how it's possible for someone who believes in biblical authority to yet be convinced of a final accumulation of this text in the Hellenistic period. In one sense, then, hopefully, our argumentation or our case will give them permission to consider that possibility. And I think that's something that I will have most appreciation of readers who approach this book with that kind of openness to say, okay, show me what you've got,
Mm-hmm.
instead of approaching it with a, I'm not going to listen, I'm not going to listen, I'm not going to listen.
Right. Right.
And all I want to do is criticize them, criticize their conclusions, label them as this or that. So I hope we've been able to do that. And that's something that I'd challenge in a sense, that I'd like to leave with readers, that they adopt that perspective.
I'll piggyback off of that to say I hope there can be assumptions that are made about the ways that you arrive at different conclusions. That if you arrive at a 6th century conclusion, you must believe this and be this kind of person. And if you arrive at a 2nd century conclusion, you must believe this and be this kind of person. And there's also the assumption that everyone who holds to one of these two positions holds them in their entirety, that there's no nuance or variation among them. And I'll give a little hint, like a teaser trailer. There's some nuance to this position, as there is, by the way, for I think most interpreters of the book of Daniel. But to pay attention to the way that what we tried to be, was consistent practitioners of a methodology that was transparent.
Yeah.
Not to leap to conclusions. And of course, there are moments where we apply a methodology inconsistently, but our goal was, as much as we were able, to say, here's the methodology that we're using. It's not changing. We're still looking at genre. We're still looking at context and culture and language. And we're reading the arguments from both sides. We don't want to give someone short shrift. And by just taking one step, one foot in front of the other, following this methodology, we arrived at this conclusion. And maybe some of our readers will depart, right? They'll take us a side road and they'll say, you should have considered this, and that's fine. But to not make assumptions that we just arrived at a conclusion and then worked backwards, because that wasn't our process. And we tried to demonstrate that.
And one of the most incredible aspects of this collaboration is that we held each other to those standards.
Oh, yes.
We had meeting weekly, having conversations about all of these things, feeling free to disagree with one another and to call each other to account. So it was an incredible collaborative process that has all the effect of making this a much better product.
We did.
That's so true.
Yeah. We worked, I think, everything out before we came to the commentary.
She always persuaded me.
It's very faithful, and I have to say, I often don't like works by two different authors because you do see them kind of shift back and forth. And I can't tell you how many times I read something and a couple chapters later from the other contributor, I go, well, that doesn't agree. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't hold the same bottle of water, so to speak. And I haven't found that in this one yet. I felt like it's been incredibly faithful and consistent all the way through. Of course, I'm only halfway through it, but
One of
really
the
good.
one of the amusing anecdotes about that is that we both
Oh,
had
yeah.
moments where one of us would say, I'm not sure I can agree with this part. And then we'd look back and figure out, oh, wait, I wrote that.
Yes.
And it happened both ways.
We forgot which one was ours, and then we put it the other person.
That's funny. So took you guys about 6-7 years to write Daniel 1 through 6. Are we going to have to wait that long for Daniel 7 to 12?
Absolutely not. 7 through 12 is coming out next year.
Next
All
November.
right. Good
It's
stuff.
already at the publisher, going
That's
through
right.
copy editing.
And what's after that?
Daniel 13 through, no.
That's right. Want to go first?
No, go ahead.
No Daniel revelation, anything like that in the works?
No.
No.
I feel daring enough writing on Daniel. I'm leaving that to others.
We've been talking about putting a book together that pulls out lots of the excurses and things from the commentary that people could use as a textbook. So we're talking with Eerdmans about that. But,
Okay.
So I am just finishing this week a book with Matt Schlemm. We're revising together his book Strange and Sacred Scripture on why the Old Testament seems so difficult and why it is difficult, but is good for you to read.
Yeah.
I'm also working on a little book that's going to be titled something like C.S. Lewis and the Apocalyptic Imagination, on C.S. Lewis's interaction with early 20th century apocalyptic works. And John has a response in that, so that will be done soon. And then eventually I'll be doing a theology of Daniel with Cambridge University Press. So I'm not done with Daniel yet.
mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Yep.
Very good. Well, thank you guys so much for being on Expedition 44 today. I certainly appreciate all of this, John. So good to have you on again. It's my favorite interviews. I look forward to every one of these. And Dr. Buster, what a gift this has been. I've wanted to get you in front of our Expedition 44 people for a long time now, and this has been a nice part of that to come on with Walton. So thank you so much for diving in, and we'll set the course for actually diving into chapters 1 through 6 next time, and maybe sooner than later get a little snapshot of 7 through 12 in there as well.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have the conversation.
Thank you. May the Lord bless you and keep you.